In 1887, Henry Morton Stanley led 700 men across Africa to rescue one governor, Emin Pasha. When Stanley found him, Emin arrived on his own steamship, dressed in clean white clothes, and fed the rescuers. But there was a problem. Emin did not want to leave. So who, exactly, was rescuing whom? Europe had already chosen the roles. Emin was the helpless victim, and Stanley was the fearless hero. Politicians and businessmen also wanted a route across Africa. The only person nobody had asked was Emin himself. Britain feared another isolated governor might die before help arrived. It had seen that story before. 2 years earlier, in Sudan, Khartoum had fallen after a long siege, shocking the British public. General Charles Gordon was killed there, just before a relief force could reach him in time. Farther south, the Mahdist revolt cut off Emin's province. Messages stopped, and rumours quickly filled the silence. To European readers, Emin looked like a second Gordon. This time, Britain promised to arrive before it was too late. A private relief committee chose the most famous rescuer it could find for the mission, Stanley. He had found David Livingstone and built a career crossing continents and making headlines afterward. The shortest route to Emin came from the east. Stanley chose a much longer route from the west. King Leopold backed the Congo route. Rescue, empire, business and fame were now travelling in the same caravan. Stanley's original records counted 706 men in the expedition before the journey began. But they were not 700 European explorers marching together through Africa in matching helmets. Most were African porters, soldiers, sailors, interpreters and craftsmen. They carried every crate, rifle and boat section. A few European officers received most of the fame. Then Stanley split the expedition into 2 separate columns. On paper, the split looked efficient. In reality, Stanley had turned one expedition into 2 disasters. The advance column left Yambuya on June 28, 1887, and entered the Ituri Forest. For roughly 160 days, they pushed through trees, rain, deep mud, and hunger. Men fell sick, loads were abandoned, some people deserted, vanished, or were left behind when they could not walk. The rescuers could barely feed themselves, and the forest was home to communities with their own roots and food. The expedition often took that food. Villages were attacked or burned for a rescue story locals never chose. At one set of rapids, Stanley decided their heavy steel boat could go no farther. Uledi, an experienced Zanzibari leader, disagreed and spoke up. He said the boat had to continue. The crew dragged it onward. Stanley gave orders, but African workers turned those orders into movement. They also paid the highest price. Meanwhile, the men left behind at Yambuya were collapsing even faster. Transport failed. Food ran short. Disease and desertion steadily broke apart the rear column waiting there. Its commander, Major Barthelot, was killed. The group sent to support the rescue now needed rescuing. Both columns were separated and weak. Stanley still did not know if Emin was alive. In December, Stanley finally reached Lake Albert. The forest opened and a wide sheet of water appeared. But Emin was not there. No governor stood waiting for Stanley on the empty shore. Stanley pulled back, built Fort Bodo, gathered food, and prepared to try again from a new base. Months passed through wrong turns, retreats, and failed messages. Then, news finally reached the expedition. On April 29th, something appeared on Lake Albert. It was no canoe. Smoke rose above it. At last, a steamship approached Stanley's camp, carrying Emin and several companions across the lake. The passengers looked so calm that Stanley had to ask which one of them was Emin. Emin stepped forward in clean white clothes, with no clear sign of sickness or panic. After months of hunger and mud, the rescuers met a man who looked healthier. Then he opened his supplies. First came 5 small bottles of champagne, a strange sight for men who had nearly starved. That was only the start. Emin still controlled steamships, stations, soldiers, and stocked storehouses across the province. His people brought grain, cattle, sheep, goats, and poultry to feed Stanley's exhausted column at the camp. The supposed captive was feeding his rescuers. Stanley, however, brought 31 cases of ammunition that Emin truly needed. Emin faced real military danger and weak communications, but he was not the starving prisoner Europe imagined. Emin wanted ammunition and a political solution. Stanley wanted Emin to leave and complete the promised rescue. When Stanley asked for a decision about leaving the province, Emin refused to give him a simple answer. Emin called himself a free agent. If his soldiers left, he would go. If they stayed, so would he. Their families mattered too. Stanley came for one man, but Emin was thinking about an entire community. When Stanley pressed him, Emin's answer was simple. We shall see. The rescued man could still say no. Then the politics around Emin changed almost overnight, and the danger became very real for everyone. Some of Emin's own officers removed him from power and detained him with Stanley's representative. The Mahdist threat remained, while Emin's soldiers argued over whether to stay, retreat, or trust their leaders. Emin stayed for his people. Then he lost control. The old myth became real. He was a prisoner. Emin was eventually freed and agreed to head for the coast, but he would not travel alone. Soldiers, families, carriers, survivors, and local groups all had to move together, more than 1,500 people. On April 10, 1889, the huge column finally left Cavalli and began its journey to the coast. By Stanley's own count, it held about 1,510 people moving together. The original expedition was shattered by sickness, death, desertion, and separation. Yet the returning column was larger. This was no quick escape. It was a moving settlement of soldiers, families, porters, and survivors. thin line on Europe's map was really 1,500 people walking toward the Indian Ocean after 2 long years. On December 4th, 1889, the expedition at last reached Bagamoyo on the East African coast. Guns fired a salute. Crowds welcomed them. At last, the carriers placed their loads on the ground. A German banquet was prepared. To the newspapers, Stanley's great rescue now had its perfect ending. History gave the expedition one evening to celebrate its long journey. Then Emin vanished from the banquet. Later that night, Emin fell about 14 feet from an upper floor onto the ground below. No one proved how it happened. Stanley thought Emin's poor eyesight might have played a part. Doctors disagreed about the injury. In moments, the celebration became a medical emergency for Emin. After surviving rebellion, prison, and the journey, Emin lay badly injured on his first night at the coast. Stanley soon left without the living symbol of his success. The victory suddenly felt empty. But Emin survived. He recovered, then in 1890, he joined the German colonial service and changed direction again. After Britain spent years bringing Emin out, he headed inland again. The rescue story had hidden ambition, violence, and empire. Hundreds were dead, missing, or left behind. Stanley changed Emin's location, but not where Emin believed he belonged.